Yeah, I was a teacher for 10 years back in, well, I qualified in the late 1990s and I was a primary school teacher for 10 years. And it was something that I fell into, really. It wasn't a planned, but at the time I was a single parent and I didn't really want to be palming my daughter off and leaving her in holiday clubs and things like this over the school holidays. So I thought, right, if I become a teacher, retrain, then, it'll help benefit my daughter. So, as I said, I spent 4 years training and I got to enjoy it as a profession. I loved being with children, but I left after 10 years because I got disillusioned with the politics and the curriculum, basically, because it was just like juggling so many different plates. We had 10 national curriculum subjects plus, well, the national curriculum had 10 subjects, but in Wales there was Welsh as well. So we had 11 curriculum subjects. We had so many extra initiatives then to juggle as well. Things like healthy schools, eco schools, on top of everything else. Ordinarily teaching children there are so many things going on in schools anyway, with concerts and assemblies, etc. It was just, you ask any teacher and they're all looking to leave. When I was fortunate that I had an escape route, so to speak, because my father had a business, well, he still has a business in the Rhondda area. So I actually went to work for him then for 10 years. But I came back to it then because I moved further west and moved further away from him. I came back to teaching because I needed something part-time at that point. Not only had we moved, but I had an aunt who was elderly and I was her carer. So I thought, right, I'll go back to doing some supply work so that I could, pick my own hours, sort of thing. And then I did that for 4 years. Saw a lot of change, obviously, in the meantime, which I can come back to later. But then eventually 2020, I decided to get out of it altogether. And I'd already started a journalism course and I completed it in 2020. So yeah, that's just me in a nutshell, really.
Yeah, my apologies. I do remember in our initial phone call, I remember you bringing up that journalism course. So my apologies for not remembering that. Everything that Nicola does, by the way, guys, she's got a couple of different outlets. She has a Substack, and I believe the other one, you had the link in your bio on X. I believe is a Conservative Woman. Is that what it's called?
Yes, the web domain. They started, I think, about 2014, and they called themselves the Conservative Woman website. But they've now they can't obviously change the website address, so they've called themselves TCW Defending Freedom because they are now of the opinion, like a lot of people share, that it's just a uni party now in the UK. There's no there's no difference between Labour and Conservative, and the way that the Tories have been acting, or the way they acted through COVID. I think the editor got disillusioned, and so yes, they now call themselves TCW Defending Freedom. So I've written quite a few things for them, and I have written for UK Column News, and one of my Substack articles got picked up by Off Guardian as well, which was nice to see.
So there we are. All of these outlets, by the way, guys, brought them up. So they'll be linked down below if you want to go and follow some of the things that Nicola have done and follow up on some of the things we're going to be talking about today. Because you said you were initially a teacher in the early 2000s. I believe you said you left the profession in 2006.
Yes, that's right. 1996 to 2006. Yeah.
And you mentioned it was because you started to see then. So again, people in my age bracket, 2006, we would have been in primary school. Would have been very, very young children. I believe I would have been in year. I believe how old did I have been? I was maybe like year 3, maybe year 2 or year 3. I'm not sure whether, if anybody happens to be listening to this out in the States, I know there's a very, very small listener base out in the States. I'm not sure what that would equate to with like kindergarten and grades and stuff like that. But very, very young children, we're talking about 6 years old was when that would have been around then. And you said you'd already noticed then that there was almost like this political infiltration into the school system, and so that it wasn't becoming just about educating children. And I noticed this as I went into got a little bit older as well, that seemingly this indoctrination through the school system started to set in even as early as you were noticing it around the turn of the second millennium, and just when you left up until 2006. What were the things that you were seeing at that time that sort of got your senses tingling, so to speak, that this actually maybe isn't good?
Well, actually, I hadn't seen it then, but I think a lot of it started soon after I left, especially with there's talk now about the over-medicalization of children, and so I know that I think the year that I left, or possibly the year after I left, that was when they started bringing in the flu mist for all the infants and giving them all the flu vaccine. But yeah, to come back to that, before I left, there were initiatives such as healthy schools and eco schools. So the eco schools initiative was obviously the forerunner for, indoctrinating children about the environment. I'm all for teaching children about nature, yes, and I do feel that we have probably got a nature emergency on our hands, but not so much the climate emergency. I think that's come on a lot in more recent years. When I came back, there had been a 10-year gap, and I could see there was obviously more things coming in then about climate change, and the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, with children being taught their rights, and I feel that rights need to be taught in conjunction with responsibilities, but there didn't seem to be so much focus on children learning their responsibilities. And of course, now in recent months, it's coming out now that schools are facing a crisis of behaviour, behavioural issues.
And this eco schools initiative was sort of like the preliminary, like the foundations, I suppose, for what we're seeing now with all of the net zero indoctrination and quote unquote education into those things, where kids are growing up now scared that the sun monster is going to devour them in the next 10 or 20 years, whatever it is. Because that was what it was like when we were in school. Everything had to be green. We were going to run out of fossil fuels. Like the planet was warming to it's going to basically burn all of us alive, and we're going to go through all these resources in the next 50 years. So we got to be carbon neutral or whatever it is by 2030. They were laying it on thick back then when I was in school, and it only got worse when I saw them looking back on it now. Didn't see it at the time, obviously. Bringing in things like cashless system, which was like the preliminary for digital ID and those kinds of things. So when you came back to the profession as a supply teacher, then how much with regards to these initiatives had you seen them progress? Like, were you massively shocked by how far you'd seen them progress, or was it kind of like, based on what you sort of started to see before, it was sort of like, oh, I'm not really surprised by this?
Yes, the latter, really. I wouldn't say I was massively shocked, but, another 5 years has gone since I left, so it probably has escalated since then. But, I was more shocked by the way, I don't know, the whole school ethos had changed in 10 years. I was warned by a colleague that was obviously still in the profession that behaviour had gone really bad, and that, children had, my colleague had parents coming to her asking for advice on parenting, which shouldn't really be happening. There's enough information out there really for parents, but I think parents are just getting so confused these days with, you know, in the last few years, we had the abolition of the reasonable chastisement defence, you know, when you're, or the smacking ban. Yeah, the behaviour had really deteriorated. And also there was a big emphasis on safeguarding, which, you know, that had really sort of escalated. But ironically, when I came back to teaching, I thought I was going to be able to go out and, as I previously did when I first qualified, you know, I thought I could go out and register with the local authority, do some supply work. You get paid when you register with the local authority, you get paid at your scale rate, and then you can, you know, maybe work in a few different schools that you can become regular schools, so that you get to know the schools, the schools get to know you, the children get to know you. But when I came back, I was told, no, it's all changed now. You can't approach individual schools. You must register with an agency. And so I then thought, right, I'll look into this. And I'd already put my CV online, and I had a phone call quite quickly from an agency. In the meantime, I'd found out that the Education Workforce Council, which is a sort of governing body for all teachers and teaching assistants in Wales, you have to be registered with them. They had brought out this thing called the return to teaching, so that if you've been out of teaching for 10 years, you have to do this return to teaching. But essentially, it was just a box ticking exercise, because I had to choose a school. So I went back to my old school, and I said, can I do this return to teaching with you? And it was basically a case of planning and delivering a few lessons, being observed, and then, you know, filling in a form, sending it off to the Education Workforce Council. So I was in the process of doing this. And of course, this agency approached me and, oh yeah, we can give you work tomorrow. And I said, well, no, you can't give me work tomorrow, because I have to do this return to teaching thing. And they didn't even know anything about it, you know. And I don't think they cared. If I'd turned around and said, yeah, that's fine, where do you want me? They'd have sent me. Anyway, I sent my return to teaching forms back, and then I asked the EWC, the Education Workforce Council. I said, right, so what's the procedure now? You know, when can I teach? And they said, well, you know, pretty much straight away. So I suspect that these forms aren't really looked at. I suspect that they don't even check with the school. You know, it's all nonsense, like a lot of things in the teaching profession, unfortunately. But anyway, so I did that. I went back and worked in a few different counties as a supply teacher. But there were a few things that I well, first of all, I joined forces with some other supply teachers, because it was shocking, really, that the poor remuneration that we would get being paid through an agency. They would take up to 40% commission for starters. And of course, in return for that, schools are not getting value for money, because they're not getting teachers. They don't care. The agencies don't care about what's the word? Having the same teacher in the same, I can't think of
consistency.
The word. Consistent. Yeah, there's another word, but it escapes me. But, you know, they just want somebody. For example, I was in a school one week. I think I was there on the Thursday, and I got talking to the children first thing in the morning. Oh yeah, you're the fourth teacher we've had this week. Continuity is the word.
Continuity, yeah.
Yeah. So the agencies don't care about continuity. They don't care even if you're suited to a particular, you know, they tried to send me once to an autistic unit. Now, although I'd worked in a school which had a speech and language unit attached to it, where many of the children were autistic or, you know, on the spectrum, and they integrated, I know I had experience of them, but I wasn't confident enough to go and work in an autistic unit, because I feel, you know, you do need special training. But the agency didn't care. They would have sent me there if I'd if I'd agreed. So there were things like that. There was, lack of continuity, lack of not caring about who they send where. I found out as well that some schools, particularly, I think this is more in secondary schools, are not sending qualified teachers. They're getting people who are employed as cover supervisors. So a cover supervisor is essentially a babysitter. So if your child is in comp and their teacher's away and they've left work for them, then these cover supervisors come in and they just essentially babysit. It's just dumbing the whole teaching profession down. And of course, the safeguarding. I picked up on a safeguarding breach actually 4 years after I'd been on supply, just before I left in 2020. My agency had told me that they'd received an email from the Disclosure and Barring Service, the DBS, the people who they sort of check to see if you've got a criminal record or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So they said they'd received an email from the DBS service to say that they didn't need to see my DBS certificate. Now, at this certificate, I'd carried with me, because the agency do tell you in your email you're supposed to carry your DBS with you when you go to any school, but nobody'd ever asked to see it. But so they had ticked a box apparently to say that they'd seen the hard copy of my DBS. And the one thing with this, I've got it written down here because in case I forget, it's possible on the DBS, there's a section of the certificate which is titled Other Information. So if that's the important part to look at, because it's theoretically possible if an agency hasn't actually had sight of the hard copy of your DBS, theoretically it was possible for anybody working in the education system via an agency to have information in that section which would normally exclude them from being employed. So that was quite a serious breach. And I funny enough, since speaking to you last week, I wanted to refresh my memory about things. So I went back and I found this in an email. I'd communicated with the Wales Audit Office on this to let them know what had happened. And they then said they would advise Estyn of the issue, which Estyn is the, the school inspectorate in Wales. So presumably hopefully that's changed now, but they were made aware of it just before I finished in 2020. So there's a lot of shenanigans going on. These agencies are, I've heard stories of head teachers being taken to the hospitality boxes in the Principality Stadium, because they want to get their agency, they want to get as much work obviously as possible for their agency. So yeah.
Grease in the right palms by the sounds.
Yes.
Grease in the right palms.